Lake management with Azure Synapse and Delta Lake. So the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I am doing a lot of this and I found there's a really big demand with a lot of different clients. I have actually I'm in the enviable, non-enviable position of having to turn away clients because this is something that is really popular for people to do. And one of the things that I find that what people want the data lake for is that they want to do Power BI and they know that they have a data in a lot of different places and they want to put it in the data lake, and then they want to have it so that they can get the data out so that they can put it into Power BI. But then, there's always other uses for that data. They may want to support machine learning. I'm always happy to talk about machine learning. I really enjoy doing it. But it's something that I find that most of my clients are like, yeah, we want to do that, but we're not doing it right now. So it's something that we definitely want to be prepared for when we're doing our data lake development so that we can support that going forward. I won't bore you about my credentials since I got a great intro already. I do want to mention that I am the presenter or organizer on the executive committee for the Arizona Data Platform Users Group, and we are also looking at doing a Data Saturday, but we are probably going to do it April, and I will have an announcement when I have a confirmation back from the people that are going to be hosting it. It'll be hosted at Grand Canyon University here in the Phoenix area where I live. All right. I did put my contact information, so
No.
if you don't question. All right. I did put my contact information into the chat, so if you um, forget to ask me a question, you can hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter later on, and I hope you follow me as well. All right. So, a little bit about data lake management. I remember when data lakes first started being talked about, it was part of the whole big data stuff and Hadoop, which is another thing that James Stern was all about. And when we're talking about big data, they had this silly metaphor. And this metaphor was for the cake in the lake. And I always thought that was so silly, but because who wants a soggy pastry? But the idea is, and I saw this, that if you don't have a well-organized data lake, you'll never be able to find anything, and your ability to use it will be limited. I see the same thing with SharePoint, and I kind of look at a data lake as kind of the SharePoint in the sky, which kind of drives purists nuts. But one of the things that's really important is you need to have a well-organized data lake, because not only is it important to find things, it's important for your security setup, which is another important element. So data lakes that you are going to be using if you're specifically looking at Azure will be an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 with hierarchy turned on, which means that you have the ability to create a number of folders. And I'm going to show you how I organize my data lake, why it's organized the way it is, and why I call things the way that I do. Now, I am specifically going to be creating data lakes to be able to support transformation, because ideally what my clients are looking for is for that one location where they can put all the data that they might be gathering and other applications such as, say, Workday, Salesforce, and Jira, and they want to put that data into a centralized location. They might also have something on-prem, Azure SQL DB, and they want to combine this data that they have in these different locations, and they want to put it together. So I'm going to probably need to transform that data so that we can have that data in a location that we can all access it for different uses, but not modify it. We're also going to want to be able to monitor how it's being used, make sure that there's adequate logging and understanding of how the data is being accessed. I'm also going to take a look at how the data is being used. Every time that I have put together a data lake, initially I'll get this conversation. Well, Don't we also need to spin up another database? And my answer to that is maybe, but maybe not. Let's take a look at how the data is being used, and then we can determine whether or not we want to create a dedicated pool in Azure Synapse, which is for a large data warehouse kind of organization. If I got a terabyte or more, I would put it in there. Or if I also want to insert data into an Azure database, a SQL database. And that has to do with how the data is being used, whether or not I want to take those steps or not with the data that is in my data lake. And security is always something that you have to think about. It's never, it's got to, I put it here last, but you really need to ensure that it's always part of the conversation, that when you're organizing anything data, to ensure that you are supporting appropriate levels of access. So let's take a look at what my sample environment is going to be like. So if, let's say that, for example, that I have a whole bunch of student information. I might be working for a small private school or a set of private schools, and I want to organize my data. Well, I'm going to get the data from wherever it comes from, and I'm going to put data in the raw area. Now, I'm not going to change the data in my raw area at all. I'm just going to write it there, and then I'm going to probably do some transformations on it. But I'm not going to change anything in my raw area. The only thing I'm probably going to do is I am going to change the data format from what it comes into to probably a parquet format. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because parquet format is a compressed format, which means that I can query and examine it more rapidly because of its ability to access the data quicker. Plus, as a benefit, it is cheaper for long-term storage. I may choose to partition my data into a yearly, a monthly, maybe even a daily partition. Depends on the kinds of data and where I'm getting it from and what my clients have to say about that. Now, I'm going to then look at how I want my data organized. So I have what I call my core area, and then my things that are outside of the core. So I have inside and outside of the core. If you look at the documentation that you see most often, Databricks was the one that really kind of pioneered data lake organization, and they've written a lot about it. And if you look at their documentation, they're always talking about, bronze, silver, and gold. And I really like silver and gold because I like jewelry. But I don't think that naming things after heavy metals is a really useful naming implementation to use, because that doesn't mean anything to anybody. I see bronze, gold, and silver, and I'm thinking jewelry. So I think that you should name things with names that have meaning so people have an understanding without having to go look at documentation for what the heck you're doing where. So I will always have a raw folder. I generally am lazy about what my root folder is. I call it root. Um, Different people call it different names. I'm boring. I just call it the root folder. And these are all underneath that. So in my raw folder, I will have the name of whatever my source system is from. By that source system could be Salesforce, Workday, and then I'm going to put my data in folders beneath that. Again, I might have it structured by day. If I know or not, I will determine that, but I'm going to have the source and then the data that is in that just completely as it comes in. I will change nothing. And the reason why is I don't want any kind of transformation on the data that's in raw. I want it to match the source exactly, and I don't want to have any questions about that. From a security perspective, I'm not going to allow any modifications to anything in raw. You can read it, but there are going to be no changes, just writes. The next area that I'm going to have is structured. Now, once I have dumped my raw data in, I'm probably going to want to clean it up. There's probably some stuff that I don't care about, and that's where I'm going to do my transformation from raw into structured. For example, I recently was working in a client where I was getting a lot of data from Salesforce. And if you've ever gotten data from Salesforce, you'll know that every single primary key is called ID. And I don't like that because it has no meaning. I also got the entire table because that's the easiest way to get it from the whole API. So I'm just dumping in the entire API source name in, which is functionally equivalent as a table. And that's what I'm getting in raw. Now in my structured area, I'm going to do renaming. I am going to exclude things that I don't want, columns that I don't care about, but I grabbed anyway. And I'm going to structure my data so that it is better available for doing joins and things that I'm going to want in my final curated area, which I'm going to use for either a data lakehouse or a data mart perhaps as well. My reference area is going to contain metadata and other elements that I need for my data transformation. For example, I'm going to be using some kind of a pipeline to get my data from the source. What files am I going to get? Well, I'll put that list of files in my reference. So if I'm going to get Salesforce and I'm going to get the salesperson file, if I'm going to get the enrollment file, whatever file that I'm going to get from Salesforce, I'll have that list in my metadata in my reference area. Perhaps I might have a folder that contains country names and the different ISO names for them because different people might want to use them. So any kind of reference material that I might be using in to create and enrich my data, I'll put in reference. Data in reference is not something that I intend to be updated very often. I might put the data that lives in there by just using my just an Azure tool to just drop a file in because I'm not expecting it to be modified. Different people will have write abilities depending upon which subdirectory is in reference. If it's metadata, of course, you can write to that so that you'll have that information. Now, the final area where I'm going to be expecting people to examine the data in the data lake is going to be in the curated area. And this is going to be joining my raw data into a cohesive data lakehouse environment so that I'll have fact and dimension tables, and I'll probably put this into Power BI. This is where I'm going to be doing my analytics area, so it's going to be very clean and well organized. Now, I've got 3 separate boxes outside of my core area for things that I will have optionally. If I have a whole lot of staging that I'm going to need to do before I create my curated, I might create a staging environment. Maybe I need to do like a couple of joins that I want to write an intermediate step. A lot of the writing that I do in my data lake is also to support a very robust pipeline. I'm going to want to create a pipeline that can be recoverable depending upon where in the process it crashed. So I would prefer to write to a location and then I would be able to start from that point forward. And that's might be why I would create a staging area to have those files staging before I get to curated because I've done some kind of long intermediate process that I want to write down. I'll have a user area if I'm looking to support people who are data scientists or people who are doing that kind of analysis. Data scientists do not care about my curated area because they're probably going to want to create their own curated area. So they don't give a hoot about what I've got, how I have my data organized, because they need it organized in a different way to do their different kinds of data science. I want to support what they do, and I know that they're probably going to be grabbing a whole bunch of data from raw, playing around with it. That's what that user area is for their discovery. And if they want to write stuff to their user area, I don't care. In my archive area, this may be in a different data lake. I may not want to keep all of my data in a hot storage area, which is what this would be in perpetuity. So I might want to split and put my older data out into archive. It could be older curated data. It could be older raw data. It just sort of depends what's going on in the organization. So these are folders that are outside of my core. So I may or may not have these folders, and they may or may not be within the same data lake, but these are things that I'm going to anticipate that I might want to do to support different uses that people might have for my data. So in terms of how I'm going to format my data lake, I probably will see these formats the most often. Well, actually, that's not true. I'm not really going to do anything with CSV. I'm going to make that go away. I'm going to really want to support Parquet and Delta Lake. Parquet format is a compressed format, and Delta Lake sits on top of Parquet format. So Delta Lake was created by Databricks as a way to make a Parquet file act more like a database. So it doesn't modify any of the data, but what it will do is it will do versioning. So what it's going to do is create more files that contain the changes so that you can go back to a different point in time. One thing that you always want to look at when you are implementing Delta Lake is how much logging do you want to occur? So because I'm going to create a lot more files when I do that, over time, I'm going to want to probably get rid of some of them. So I'll only be able to go back for a certain point in time. So I got to look at what's is important to do. Do I need to go back 30 days, a week? What's my time frame that I want to do? Because I'm going to be managing the files that live in Delta Lake, because those are going to contain all of my transaction logs that are changed. So basically, I'm going to implement Data Lake on top of Parquet. So I have to have Parquet to have Data Lake, and that will then write more Parquet files. So a little bit about Delta Lake. It has some really nice features that allow it to perform better as a file format. You can use it to enforce the schema. So if I'm doing a write, and let's say that something changes from text to numeric, and this actually happened to me when I was doing some machine learning analysis on information from a bunch of water pumps. So I was analyzing what the standard flow was for different residential smart meters. And how this was occurring is we were just getting all this data and we were going to look at it later. Well, later came, and the data didn't have any tagging information. So I just got 11 columns of data, and I had what the map was supposed to be. Again, that will be something that I would have in my reference file so that I knew what the different columns were supposed to represent. Well, I was supposed to get 11, and all of a sudden I got 14. What happened was there was a new model of smart meter water pump that was implemented, and it had a different data format. So if we had known earlier, then things wouldn't have blown up. But with schema enforcement, if I was trying to write 14 columns when I was only expecting 11, I would get an error. I would write the files anyway, but it would tell me that it wouldn't write it to the same place because it wasn't what I was expecting. And that's something that I can implement with Delta Lake. I can also implement something called compaction. As you might guess, if you are looking at a whole bunch of little files, that takes a while from an IO perspective to process. Because what I have to do is I have to take all those little files and then read them and then load them up, and that takes time. If I do something called compaction, what I'm doing is basically say, pretend this is one file. And I can probably do that if I've got a whole bunch of files that I might be looking at for a given month. I might have a file for every day, so I'm going to use compaction, so I just see one file instead of, say, 31 for the month of January. I also have this feature called time travel, which is basically the ability to log, so I can go back and see how my data changed. And I can also do data skipping, which is basically a kind of indexing that I can do. Delta maintains file stats so that it knows how to skip files. So it knows how to use the partitions so that it knows, hey, I'm not going to look at a file that says 2022 in it because this is 2023. I know the data that I want isn't there, so I'm going to skip that one because I know I don't need it. So these are some of the features that you get with Delta Lake, which is why people are more likely to implement that on top of a Parquet format. So if you're looking at areas that you can do Delta Lake, if we're talking specifically about Azure Synapse, and naturally we are, that's something that you can do in Spark, you can do in runtime, and you can use in serverless. So Delta Lake is part of Spark. Interesting story there. When Databricks first created Delta Lake, they made part of it open source and part of it proprietary, but they got called out by Snowflake and basically said that they were violating the open source rules. And Databricks said, oh yeah, I guess we are. And so they've now made everything available as part of Delta Lake. And you make something into Delta Lake using either Spark or your iteration runtime. You just change the format to a Delta Lake format from Parquet, implementing then this new structure on it. And you can access those files via serverless pools within Azure Synapse.
Ginger, can I ask a question? Yeah.
Sure.
When you're saying about the Delta Lake, we're also having all these files saved in Parquet. So
right.
what additional things we need to do to make sure, okay, this is Delta? So what is the difference actually?
So basically with Delta, instead I will have another file that it is created every time there's any kind of a change. So if anything changes, it'll write another file. What that means if I have, let's say so it's not going to impact raw very much unless I am overwriting raw files, and then it'll just keep on inserting another one. But if I'm doing any kind of transformation, it'll keep a before version and an after version. So I can always look back and see what changed. So I will end up having a lot more Parquet files. And with Delta Lake, it knows, read this last one. So I have a whole lot of files, and I'm reading the last one, and it's managing that internally. Does that make sense?
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. It is still a Parquet formatted file, but it contains other information that allow me to do different commands on it that I can't do in a Parquet file. Like I can't do compaction on a Parquet file because it's like compaction. I don't know what that is. And I can't look at how the data looked like 3 days ago in Parquet because it doesn't know how to do that. And that's something that Delta Lake knows instead. Does somebody else have a question?
Yeah, I think Sajid, you can go ahead, ask the question.
Yeah, Ginger. Yeah. So, Ginger, you mentioned about version maintenance, right? Like
Yes.
Delta maintains the version. So my question is like, is there any time duration where these version files are getting purged? Because it's anyway going to like keep on writing at your Delta Lake, right? So because in Databricks, just to compare, we have the vacuum command. So which actually does the vacuum of all your versions and keeps only the latest. Like it's up to you to do the vacuum of the version.
Exactly.
So do we have anything similar in
it's
Synapse?
It's exactly the same.
Okay.
So
there
you
is
have
no
to
much.
basically. Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead, Ginger. Sorry.
I was going to say, so you have to manage how long you want to go back because you will get a ridiculous number of files.
Yeah,
to your
that's
point.
what. So when you mentioned about the files, it's another headache, right? It's an additional headache that we have to keep maintaining the files. Of course, it's in the cloud and everything, but still, for us to go backtrack and see huge number of versions, it's always good to like for us to know what is the number of versions we need to have for doing the time travel and all that stuff. So yeah,
exactly.
that was okay. So another question, quick question. So just to compare with Databricks, because I come from that background as well. So, what exactly is the key difference of using Delta table on Synapse as well as Databricks? So, what is that highlighting feature which the convincing factor that drives me to use Synapse?
So if we're just talking about Delta Lake and Spark,
Yeah.
they're relatively the same.
Okay.
So what you get into, and I'm going to get into this in a minute, is what you do with the data once you have it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the actual, because Databricks and Snowflake got in this tiff. Now what is in Databricks is now open source.
Yeah.
So the difference is that Databricks has a little newer version because this just happened a little while ago, and they always will have a new version because they're the ones doing more of the modification.
Yeah, because
So
they own Spark as well, right? So they do have the latest version. But still, we can use at least one level, like prior version of Spark still, right? Like
yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of now, I will say, so with this now, if we're talking two different things here. So if we're talking about Spark, Databricks is using a proprietary version of Spark. So their version of Spark is not exactly the same as what is used in Synapse. So what that means is I can't cut and paste my code exactly from Databricks because they have a proprietary format. Now, what this proprietary stuff, the reason that is it's faster.
Exactly.
I'm not going to dispute that at all. They have figured out how to make the Spark code run faster in a Databricks than it does in Synapse.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So, but I do want to, I mean, this is, I always get this question. I've actually done a couple of sessions on what the difference is between Databricks and Synapse. And really, if you're just doing Spark and you're just doing Databricks, well, it'll run the Spark faster, and the Delta Lake part is the same. So what is different is something that is now in preview in Databricks, but has been in Synapse for several years now, and that is the ability to make databases on top of it, which is a very powerful tool that people really like when they are trying to access it, especially non-technical types. So that is the reason that I have this curated area, so people can actually use it. So that brings me to my demonstration for that. So the point of the difference between, of course, doing things in Spark versus doing it in Synapse is what you get afterwards. So naturally, Databricks and Spark, and Synapse both use the same data lake, and Azure Data Lake Gen 2. So if you look at your storage browser, look at your blob containers, you can see what your different elements are. And this is more of this is not as clean as another version that I will show you, but this is showing me my different raw data. Now my data within here, I can end up with a whole lot of different files for Parquet if I want to be able to go back, but sometimes I don't. And sometimes I just want it just to be just one file will work for me, and I don't necessarily need to write a whole bunch of files. So I might have Parquet. Now the difference between what you can do with that file once you've got it in Synapse, that's what I wanted to show you. So the difference is, what's doing now? Boy. So within Synapse, if I've got my data lake, I can link a number of different data lakes into my environment. I have one that is primary because when you create a Synapse environment, you either create a Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, or you use one that you already have and say, hey, make this my primary. And anything that I have as my primary, then I can take a look at it here within Synapse, and I don't have to care what the format is. So if I'm looking at what I was looking at before, and I want to look at my Salesforce data that I have in my data lake, I can just take a look at it by just clicking on it and saying, give me top 100 rows of this. And I can take a look at my data here within Synapse, querying it. It wrote the code for me. I didn't have to write anything, and I can see what I have. Now, when I'm doing this within Synapse, I neither know nor do I have to necessarily care If this is Delta Lake, this is Parquet. If it is CSV, it'll work a little bit differently, but it's going to act like this is a data table that I can take a look at. So I can look at my different elements within here and take a look at them. Now I'll show you what my, so in my raw area, what I have in there is a whole bunch of source information. It's basically, back in the day, we used to call that an operational data store. And what I can do with my operational data store is I can create data warehouses on top of it. And my data warehouses that are not really data, it's not really a database. It's just another way to look at my files. And it's always helpful to be able to do that. So let me show you what I can do here when I open up Management Studio. Is I can take a look at my content. And again, I don't have to care what it looks like. So in a minute, this will load up. Sorry, this is taking so long. All right. So within this particular lake, I'm going to take a look at at my data and pretend it's a database. And it's not, but I'm going to pretend that it is. And the reason that my clients really love this is because everything that I'm telling you about Delta Lake and Parquet and how to make it work, they start getting confused. And what they really want to know is, what does my data look like? I want to see what I'm actually gathering so I know if I've got the right stuff or not. I mean, I know it's coming from the application, but what am I really getting out of it? So here I have created a database that basically has the different sources. This is the MPAT source, and this is for Salesforce. And so I can take a look at my records as if they were in Salesforce. So this is the raw data. And you can see these have got kind of silly names, bunch of junk here. But this is not a database, but you can treat it just like one. So this is something that I do with all of my data lakes, create this serverless view on top of it so that my clients can take a look at what I'm doing. And this way they can do their own data investigation. We can do validation, making sure that I have gathered the data that they're interested in, and they have a really good idea without having to know necessarily how to code, how to access the data. So where is this data? This is all in raw. And I'll show you how you can create a table in your database from your raw information. And I haven't showed my client how to do this because, you know, it's just too easy. So if I want to create this database and then look at files beneath it, what I'm going to need to do is do a right click on this and say create an external table. And what I will need to do is, it's not smart enough to be able to type my data. So I'm probably going to need to create my data from there. So I'm just going to say this is called, I don't know, SFO account. And I'm going to create a SQL script. And this is going to provide me the code for creating that external table that's part of my database. So the reason that I'm doing all this data lake stuff is so that I can pretend it's a database. And the reason for this is because this is cheap. I can query these elements in my serverless database for $5 for a terabyte. If I would instead, you know, and my current clients, I have one that's a nonprofit, and if they don't spend money on Azure, they instead spend money helping children. So I think that's kind of a great use of their money, not so much paying Azure bills. So if they have this database and they're okay with the data being slower, then they can query it in Management Studio, just like they were doing before, should they need to do that outside of standard reporting models. and take a look at the data without having to put up a Azure database to do it. I sized the database to see whether or not that would be something that they would want to do. And it would basically run them, appropriately sized database would run them at $1,500 a month. They're probably paying around right now like $75 to do all the querying they want to do instead. So guess what? They really like this because I'm taking my data lake and I'm making a database out of it. So how did I get it into this format where it looks like a database? I'll show you how to do that too. Now, one thing that's really great about doing Synapse, and I know that Databricks is getting there, but Synapse is already here now, is if I choose to use a Delta Lake format, it's smart enough to pick the right file. So I don't have to worry about my vacuuming up and my time traveling, but I do need to manage that within my environment, within my pipeline to be able to do that. So taking a look at my pipeline that I've generally created for this, I do different kinds of pipelines depending upon what I'm doing. So for getting if I'm loading data from Salesforce, I really am going to just use whatever the fastest way of getting that to make that happen. And to be honest, the fastest way of making that happen is to use a copy from a copy command that would be similar to what you would use in Azure Data Factory. This has been optimized for speed. I can use the driver for Salesforce and I can get all of that. And then I can start running my notebooks to put it into the different areas. And I could automatically take it into Delta Lake in here from as well. And in my notebooks, I can include my vacuuming up portion so that I am only storing the amount of data that I want to do. So I'm getting my names from my reference area. I've just got a flat file where you see I'm getting my different names. It's in my reference area for pipelines. So I'm saying, hey, for all of these names, go get that data, will you? And then once you get it and you write it, you put it into the raw area, then let's go ahead and load it into structured and then load it into my curated area. So I'm done. I've got my pipeline loaded. This means that they have all of the flexibility of using pipelines that have all the monitoring that they might be used to, because if they've done anything with Azure Data Factory, it's a familiar and comfortable environment for them. Because I don't want to eventually be the one that's doing a lot of maintenance. When I write my notebooks, I tend to write them so that they contain a lot of SQL, because my clients know SQL and I want them to be able to read and run the code. So I'm using a lot of creating and replacing the temp view, which means that after that, I can pretend that this is a table and write SQL and write my data that way. Now you may be thinking, well, it's more efficient to write it in Python. And I will say you are right, but my clients know SQL, they don't know Python. So I write a lot of what I'm doing in SQL so that they can do the ongoing support and maintenance, because I don't like maintenance. And they get a good feeling about being able to understand what's going on, that I'm not just writing a whole bunch of garbage and running off, because they understand this. So that's also part of this, because I like to maintain a kind of a mentoring relationship with clients, because I don't expect that they will keep up with technology like I do, but they should have I should be able to provide them the tools that they need to be able to access it. So once, any questions about that?
I have a question, Ginger.
Sure.
In your pipeline, do you have like the code where you're telling this has to save as a delta?
Yes. So I've got wrong thing. So I am putting it to I'm writing Delta initially in the pipeline, and then all of my modifications are I'm writing it for Delta as well. So I just include that inside of the notebook, yes.
Oh, in the notebook, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm writing to Delta. That part is in the pipeline, but then within my notebook, I'm handling the rest of it within there. So kind of a combination. Question?
I think John has a question, then I'll ask the rest of the part. John,
Sure.
go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks. There is a lake database introduced to the Synapse. I'm wondering, are you able to make any comments compare with Delta Lake?
I'm not I know what you are talking about. It uses Delta Lake. So it's using Delta Lake or Parquet.
It is also using the parquet files.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just basically, without getting to a whole lot of stuff that might get me in trouble with my NDA, that has to do with a bigger way of organizing your data from an enterprise perspective. So the steps that I'm doing to organize my data and put it into Delta Lake are going to be the same. And the rest of the environment has to do with how you're going to be using that from an enterprise perspective. And I will say that there's some really amazing, cool stuff that's coming out with Synapse, but it's not there yet. And I'm going to specifically talk about the stuff that I have implemented and has been available for a while. And I can't wait to use the new stuff when more of it is available. How's that?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, because that is, as soon as more of it is released, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about it. But yeah, I don't want to get in trouble with, there was a really great meeting this week. It's just awesome stuff that's coming out, but we'll go with what's here now. So what's here now, one thing is not going to change. My clients have data that comes from all over the place. I don't know where the heck is. They don't know enough about their applications to be able to tell me where it is. And they know they want to have reporting over all of the environments that they have. And that part somebody is still going to have to do, because you need to know what the business rules are to count the different items and how you're going to be able to join it. And that's what I'm putting into my curated area. And it's Parquet and Delta Lake now. And that's the kind of stuff that I am putting into Power BI so that they can do reporting on it. So if I'm looking to do my data transformations, so I'm probably going to be looking at doing, like I said, I showed you my integration pipeline. I'm basically going to use the upserts, which basically are what it's going to be doing instead of an inserts, which creates that additional table element, allowing me to take advantage of that. And I will have to go through my logic and then allow me to do that vacuuming steps so that I don't have a ridiculous number of files, because the point raised earlier, I am going to end up with a whole bunch of extra files in the future with that. So what I really do when I'm implementing it within Synapse is I'm going to take advantage of my serverless pool. And Delta, of course, integrates with serverless, so it doesn't care what the format is. And then I can write SQL in notebooks if I want to within the Synapse environment, or I can create databases that I can access through things like Management Studio. So just doing that demonstration. So I wanted to show you how the steps that I do to make that happen. So we'll take a look at that within Azure. So what I'm going to do is, once I've got my, if we look at the files I have curated, I've got a number of different, folders that contain the different elements for all of my Delta Lake formats. They're all within here. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a database out of doing this. And let me show you the code that I'm going to be using for that. So what I'm first going to do is I'm first going to create my database. I first create the database, and then I will write the key for it. So once I've created my database, then I'm going to create a master key. I'm going to then make sure that I've got a data source where my stuff is coming from. I'm going to select my type here, create different schemas that I'm going to use, and then it's going to allow me to access my database. Now, in terms of access, there's two ways that I can securely access my database. One thing that I can use, if we look at my Synapse environment, onto it within Azure. So I've got two ways that I can securely access my data. If we look at my Synapse environment, when I created it, I created a SQL admin username, and I can always use this to connect to my data. In terms of security, what I am going to need to do is I am going to need to provide read access to users in the curated area so that they can access that data. After that, I don't need to give anybody any access to the data through Synapse because they don't need to be in the Synapse environment at all. They're just accessing the data. The fact that Synapse is the location where I created the database is not relevant, but I can also choose to give them rights within my serverless database within Management Studio. So I can create different IDs and groups to provide people different levels of read access or restrict access as if I would any other database. So I have database functionality within a serverless database from a security perspective as well. So I do need to give read rights, but I can restrict different elements just as I would a database using the same levels of security that I would if this was a SQL database, which is really a pretty powerful way to doing it. And then what I can do is I can access my data that is in my database as if it was a SQL database. So if I look at, open this up, I have a Power BI report that's going to be where I am connecting to this data, which is the primary way that people are going to access it. So they're going to be accessing it using this serverless file. Now, what's beautiful about this is that then my Power BI developers don't need to know anything about Delta Lake. They don't need to know anything about Synapse. All they need to know is how to connect to it. And how they're going to connect to it is they're going to go to SQL Server. I, of course, have a parameterized name for this. And so I'm just going to say, hey, this is the, I need to get the server name. The server name here. And I'm going to get the database name here and say, okay. So that's all they need to do. If I've got it parameterized, if we look at transform data, we can, or edit my parameters, we can see that this is the name of my virtual database, and this is the server. So from their perspective, they call this a database from now on. They don't even recognize this as a data lake because to them, it's not. It fully made it so that to them, a bunch of Delta Lake files in ADLS Gen 2, it's a database. Now, can I make this, is it going to be slower than an actual database? Absolutely. It's not a database. It's a data lakehouse, if you want to get real technical. It's just a bunch of files that I have in ADLS Gen 2. Do they care? Not enough to pay $1,600 a month for a database. If they did, I'd be happy to migrate all of the data to a database for them using Polybase to insert the stuff from the curated into tables into a database, but they don't care because the amount of time that they do ad hoc querying is relatively infrequent. And in that scenario, they would use Management Studio to do those kinds of queries. And if they have to wait a little while, they're fine with it because their primary use for having this data lake setup is so that they can do Power BI and get data from multiple sources and not know or care where it came from. So I'm able to achieve that using a lot of different tools, Spark, Parquet. I use the Azure Data Factory components to get some of the data. so that I can put it into a format that I can pretend to be a SQL Server database so that we can access it in Power BI. So a couple things to remember on this. If you're going to play around with it, you're going to need to do a lot of the kind of maintenance in Spark where you vacuum up and determine how long you need to go back for. For my current clients, actually, we're just going back a week because honestly, they have the source data. So it's not that big of a deal if they have to get it again. In most cases, they can do that. I'm probably going to be writing up most of my ETL in Spark. It's much easier way of doing that. It's much more robust and it can handle a lot more data. Delta is in preview and integration. Actually, that's now not in preview anymore. And if you create it in Spark and you're using Delta Lake, it works great in serverless. So nobody needs to know or care where your data is actually located. So basically, using Delta Lake allows you to have a lot of the different benefits of having database-like features and improved performance on top of a Parquet file. You can definitely use Spark to create and maintain your Delta Lakes. It's got full integration if you're going to use pipeline. And then I can use serverless on top of Data Lake and just pretend it's a database. And I have found that this is an architecture that is really popular with a lot of my clients who don't have to worry about learning a lot of new skills. And it meets their primary objective to be able to create a relatively inexpensive data warehouse, which isn't a data warehouse, it's just serverless on top of ADLS Gen 2. So with that, any questions?
Well, yeah, there is a question in chat.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
So what's my recommendation to keep the costs in Azure Synapse low? Use smaller Spark pools. If you're going to do anything with data integration, for goodness sakes, don't use data flows because those are ridiculously stupid expensive. And you can, if people are not doing a whole lot of ad hoc querying on your serverless, then your serverless queries can be quite low. So it's going to be relatively inexpensive. So if you don't care how long it takes to run things, then you can provision more economical pools to decrease the cost. So definitely you can do that. It's not ridiculous. If you want to make sure that Synapse stays inexpensive, never create a dedicated SQL pool. Those will eat you alive.
Well, I know John is raised hand for asking one question, but I have very kind of connected question. You just replied, Ginger, who says, you mentioned not to use the data flow, but actually we're using the data flow many cases. One of the reason is it's easy to actually create the pipeline. Is a graphical user interface. If you know a bit of regular expression, you can build it. So do you want to make some comments on it?
So yeah, the reason that I don't like data flows is because they're relatively difficult to debug. And yes, you do need to learn some Python to be able to write ETL within Spark. But as you saw in the Spark that I'm writing, I write a lot of SQL. And I'm writing that within Spark. And it's ANSI SQL, not T-SQL. So there's a couple of the different commands. But that way I find it a lot more robust because it's easier for me to start in the middle. And to the point that was made in chat, it's less expensive. So, you're going to play that game there of like, yes, where's your cost going to be? Is your cost going to be in running or in learning a new skill? So
in that case, Ginger, is still like, for example, the data flow is still the Spark engine, right?
It is. But Microsoft charges you more for running them.
I got it.
So I'm not, it runs on Spark, yes, but it costs you more money.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, John, go ahead, please.
Okay. Ginger, in your sample code, you seems creating a master key for the serverless database. Is that a best practice? Even I don't need any encryption.
Right. It's just what you need for a serverless database. It's a little bit pickier. It's not, this is not providing transparent data encryption. It's just
Right.
a requirement for that. So.
Is a requirement?
Well,
don't
it's considered
remember.
it's considered a best practice. So it may not be a
Oh, okay.
requirement per se.
Yeah, yeah. You certainly can use serverless without a master key.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Good point.
If you create that master key, what kind of benefit you could get?
To be honest, I don't
Mhm.
know. I know that
Okay.
when I first started doing this, that's how the product team recommended you do it.
Okay.
And I honestly don't know what the
Mhm.
benefit is in terms of doing it, because I just okay, just have done it that way. And that's a really good
Sure.
point. I do need to find out what my benefit is for doing that.
Mhm.
Other than
Okay.
that's what the product team told me that would be the best practice to do.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Somebody else has their hand up.
Yeah, Ganesh, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, hey Ginger. This question is actually a follow-up on the bunkers and the other cost-effective methods. For usual ETL jobs, right? Like we prefer a data orchestration in the ADF and mostly the transformations on the ADB using the Spark SQL, like you mentioned, ANSI SQL jobs. Do you think that's a cost-effective method, or skipping the Databricks altogether for transformations and going for this SQL stored procedures or any other SQL transformations?
So in terms of ADF versus Synapse, it's the same code. If you look at anything in like Microsoft Learn, it says that at the top, pretty much it's the same. So from whether or not you do it in ADF or Synapse, that portion of it is going to be the same cost. And now when it comes to which is more economical, if it's more it depends on how you write it.
Yeah.
Spark can be more economical than writing. Let's say that you did your SQL and you were doing your SQL in an integration runtime versus you're doing it within Spark. Yes, it does have a Spark engine that you're running, but it doesn't process it in the exact same way. So it's my understanding that writing SQL using this direct Spark engine is a little less expensive.
Okay, that's good.
So,
Quick question on what Ganesh asked. I think Ganesh mentioned about ADB, right? You mentioned about Databricks, I think so, Ganesh, right?
Yeah.
For
So
Databricks,
Ginger,
I'm sorry, I missed that aspect
Ginger,
of it.
his question was like comparing doing the data flow and then calling the Databricks notebooks, or writing that Spark code which I wrote on Databricks directly on the Spark on Synapse. So that's what he wanted to compare. I
Okay,
think.
sorry, I
If read the question.
misunderstood.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about notebooks in Databricks versus notebooks in Synapse, trying to think, if that is going to be pretty close, it may, and this is like, I'd have to know a lot more about your environment to say, but it may be cheaper to do it in Databricks if you have a lot of data because it's a little bit faster, but it may be this, it may not be. I think it's be really close. The difference I think would be very small. But I'm thinking that from a cost perspective, you'd probably get the edge on Databricks, but that's a maybe.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, cool. I think yeah, it does depends on a lot of other factors as
Yeah.
well. I do understand that, but just wanted to get an overview on how it could be.
Yeah, no, that's a very, if you're using Databricks, Databricks is a very good product, and it's certainly not going to be more expensive than Synapse. I think you'll find it to be so close to be not that big of a deal, but if there's going to be a difference, Databricks will be cheaper because of its engine being faster.
Right, sounds good. Thanks, Ginger.
Question. Okay, and I have there's some questions in chat. Arthur asked, how full is a Spark SQL complete versus ANSI SQL? It's very close. I will say that having written a lot of ANSI SQL in Spark, there's one or two little things that are different. I don't remember what they were, but when Stack Overflow, I'm like, how come this isn't working? It said for Spark, you have to do this one thing different. So I would say 98% ANSI, but not 100. And I have run into a couple of things that's just a minor tweak that's different, that won't work exactly like ANSI. So close, but not exact. Data flows are really good when you need to combine different types of sourcing feeds within your file store, relational data store, and much more. Yes, but I can also do that within a notebook. Again, this is all about what you want to do, what your trade-offs are, because you got to look at the skills of the people that you have. If you have people that are really good with data flows, then you're going to want to do that because it's cheaper to generate them because people know what they're doing. If people know neither data flows nor Python or Spark rather, and you're trying to teach somebody, the question is, if they don't know either one, which one do you want to learn? So that I think is really the question. But if you, again, to your point, you know data flows, and if you've been using a data factory for a while and that's a skill that you're really comfortable with, then that's probably going to be faster than you, but it's not going to be less expensive to run. So always trade-offs.
Thank you. Ginger, I think there is one more question from Sajid. You raise your hand.
Yeah,
You can unmute yourself.
yeah. There's got two people with their hands up, and
Oh
Arthur asked
no,
me a question.
sorry, that was my bad. I did not
Okay.
actually put my hands down. I'm very sorry.
I know. Anyone else?
Arthur's got a question. He says, can Azure Function run data flows? Can it query Delta Lakes? Well, an Azure Function can run a data flow.
Can
but
I go ahead? I know.
Yeah.
Because I was no, actually you cannot.
Cannot?
Because,
Okay.
no, because in ADF for Synapse, you can embed that as a Azure function in your pipeline, but Azure function run data flow. No.
Yeah, it's not going to run it.
No.
Okay. Can it query the Delta Lakes? I don't know.
Me neither. I never tried it.
I never tried it. Yeah, it's just like, I don't know why I would want to do that. So I have not tried. Maybe? I have no idea. That's a really good question. Now I want to find out the answer. Got two really good questions, the things that I don't know that I need to find out now.
I have very, kind of consecutive question, or rather like suggestion I would like to have, for example, in our team, as you just mentioned even a few times, that we are using data flow. And now, as you mentioned, I looked at your code too, that, hey, it says Spark SQL, which is close like how we use the SQL code, because we all in team are SQL expert. And now this little parts that come is the Python, right? So because I see in the code, you have to also use the Python code to run that in Spark, right? So can you have a kind of guideline or to start with, okay, follow this, you'll be get and go and running in a few days or a few weeks. So do you have any kind of suggestion or any kind of guideline or any books to refer with or anything?
For doing pipelines or converting your stuff over, or what are you specifically
not converting,
asking?
rather, for example, we have the data flow, right? So
okay,
we could be open to that. Okay, not only using the data flow, rather also start working with notebook, where you use the Spark SQL, right? And then you can embed that notebook to the pipeline.
Right. So I think that you would want to start doing it if you were adding something new to it, or you had a data source that had like some difficult things that you wanted to do. Like, for example, if you need to like clean up the data and do a regex, that's so much easier to do in a notebook. Parsing XML, much easier to do in a notebook. Or if you just want to basically say, well, I know now I didn't write this thing, but I want to, write a SQL statement from some data that I new source of data that I have. Once you've got it, one thing that I really think that it's not worth doing necessarily in a notebook from a rewrite perspective is the drivers and the copy command is really good. So I'll copy using notebooks, excuse me, not using notebooks. I might do my copying using the copy command with the ADF functionality. But after that, all of my manipulation, I tend to do that within Notebook. So if you know that you're going to be creating a new file, maybe that's something that you would choose to write in a notebook if you're adding a new portion onto your existing pipeline. So if you know you're going to do something that you don't already have, start doing it in pipeline. So what you'll just need to do is the code to do it is relatively simple. You load whatever your data source is into a data frame, and then you use that create or replace temp view command, and then it's a table, and then you can write Spark SQL on it. So, but it's ANSI, not Transact.
We need to look into it for sure.
Yeah.
If there is no question, I don't know, anyone have any question? Where's maybe no? If not, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
It was great having you, Ginger, to learn a
Thank
lot
you
of
very
this.
much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And everyone who have joined, thank you so much for your, time and joining, asking all the questions, good engagement.
Yeah.
We really had a good time.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. We can end the call and have a great evening.
You too.
Dipankar, by any chance, will we get this the recording link by any chance? Are you going to
Yeah, recording as well as the content. So Ginger, if you can send me your PPT as a PDF, so we can share that with the whole audience.
So just curious, where is the audio recording going to be?
The recording will upload to the YouTube channel.
Okay.
And I'll share that with you too.
Great. I just need to know where it is so I can put it in my little thing.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'll send you a copy of the slides.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.